Kansas City records a homicide every 29 hours. That's not a dramatic headline, that's the actual math for 2025. While you're sleeping, working, or watching Netflix, someone in this Missouri city is getting killed. And here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. It's been like this for years. The numbers are brutal. 84 murders in just the first half of 2025, up 12% from the same period in 2024. The violent crime rate sits at 1,477 per 100,000 residents, which means it's 3 times higher than the national average. To put that in perspective, you're more likely to be a victim of violent crime in Kansas City than in most other American cities of similar size. But it's not just about murders. A non-fatal shooting happens every 13 hours. Every single day, someone catches a bullet and survives to tell about it. The city reported 7,534 violent crimes in 2023 alone. That's not counting property crimes, which add another 25,393 incidents to the tally. Walk through neighborhoods like East Side and you'll find crime rates exceeding 1,200 violent incidents per 1,000 residents. In Hidden Valley, residents have a 1 in 10 chance of becoming a crime victim. That's not a statistic you see in the tourism brochures. Schools close because of nearby shootings. Buses become crime scenes. Parks turn into battlegrounds. The violence touches everyone. In Raytown, just outside KC, an 11-year-old girl was murdered recently. 15-year-old Terrell Bell was shot dead in Sycamore Park after what started as a school bus argument. Surveillance footage showed multiple people chasing him down before someone grabbed a gun from a car and fired. This is Kansas City in 2025, a place where 70,000 buildings sit abandoned, where 90,000 empty lots provide cover for criminal activity, and where entire communities live under constant fear. The question isn't whether violence will happen today. The question is where and how many. So why did Kansas City earn the nickname Killa City? To understand that, we need to go back almost a century to when men in expensive suits decided this Midwestern city would become America's most wide-open criminal playground. Kansas City's violence didn't start with gangs or drugs. It started with men in tailored suits who turned crime into a legitimate business model. The Civella family arrived in the early 1900s and saw opportunity where others saw a quiet Midwestern city. Nicholas Civella built an empire on 3 foundations: illegal gambling, prostitution, and bootleg liquor during Prohibition. But his real genius wasn't the crimes themselves, it was the system he created to protect them. Police officers received regular payments, city officials looked the other way, judges made cases disappear. Kansas City became what mob historians call an open city, a place where organized crime operated with complete impunity. The corruption ran deep. Beat cops collected weekly envelopes. Detectives warned mob operations about raids. Politicians received campaign donations that bought silence and cooperation. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was the entire barrel. Then came the 17th of June, 1933. Union Station, morning rush hour. Federal agents were transporting prisoner Frank Nash when gunmen opened fire. 4 law enforcement officers and 1 FBI agent died in what became known as the Kansas City Massacre. Pretty Boy Floyd and other notorious criminals were linked to the attack. The massacre shocked America. It led to new federal anti-crime laws and helped J. Edgar Hoover transform the FBI into the powerful agency it became. But here's what the history books often miss. The reforms didn't end organized crime in Kansas City. They just changed who was in charge. The Civella organization adapted, survived, and continued operating into the 1,980 More importantly, they left behind something permanent: an infrastructure of corruption, a template for criminal organization, and a culture where violence was just another business tool. While the Italian mob was building this foundation, another force was shaping Kansas City's future: segregation. Federal housing policies, called redlining, systematically denied mortgages to black families in certain neighborhoods. The city became divided by design, with African-American communities concentrated in specific areas, cut off from resources and opportunity. These weren't ghettos that just happened. They were created deliberately through policy and practice. By the 1,970 the Italian mob's grip was loosening. Federal pressure, internal conflicts, and changing times created a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does organized crime. What emerged in Kansas City's black neighborhoods was something different but equally deadly: the Black Mafia. This wasn't one organization, but a network of criminal groups operating primarily on the East Side and South Side. They inherited the mob's playbook: control territory, eliminate competition, and maintain power through fear. But they added their own innovations born from decades of systemic oppression and limited economic opportunity. The Black Mafia specialized in drug trafficking, extortion, and violence that served as both punishment and advertisement. Public executions sent clear messages. Witnesses learned quickly to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. And just like the Sevilla family before them, these new criminal organizations found allies among corrupt officials who were happy to continue the profitable tradition of looking away. Neighborhoods like Blue Hills and East Side became war zones. The police were either absent, overwhelmed, or compromised. Residents found themselves trapped between violent criminals and indifferent authorities. Homicide rates that had been relatively stable in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds began climbing steadily through the 1,970 seconds. But the real disaster was happening in slow motion. After World War II, white families fled to the suburbs in massive numbers. The few jobs that had sustained working-class black families began disappearing. Ford Motor Company moved its operations to Claycomo in 1951, devastating neighborhoods like Blue Valley, where factory workers had built modest but stable lives. In Blue Valley today, about a third of the housing dates back to 1,939 or earlier. The median home sale price in the 1,980 seconds was around $6,000. That's not a typo. Properties were worth so little that they were essentially abandoned. Schools lost funding, parks deteriorated, basic services collapsed. This wasn't just economic decline, it was systematic abandonment. By the time the 1,980 seconds arrived, Kansas City had roughly 30,000 abandoned houses. Entire blocks sat empty. These vacant properties became staging grounds for crime, crack houses, weapons, stashes, and murder scenes where bodies might not be discovered for days or weeks. Crack cocaine arrived in Kansas City in the late 1,980 seconds, and it didn't just bring addiction. It brought an entirely new level of violence. The drug was cheap to produce, highly addictive, and created massive demand almost overnight. Suddenly, every street corner became valuable territory worth killing for. Young men, many of them teenagers, were recruited as dealers. Some were barely 13 years old when they started working corners. The money was better than anything else available in neighborhoods where legitimate jobs had disappeared decades earlier. But the work came with a price. You either proved your willingness to use violence, or violence was used against you. The gangs that emerged during this era weren't local kids playing tough. They were affiliated with major West Coast organizations. The Crips and Bloods brought their colors, their rules, and their ruthless approach to territorial control. By 2008, Kansas City recorded 118 homicides, a number that seemed shocking at the time, but would later be surpassed. The 51st Street Kitchen Crips controlled an area they called Fogtown. The 57th Street Rogue Dog Villain Bloods held territory in Blue Hills. 4 Trey Crips ran operations around 39th Street in Vineyard. The 40th Street Mafia, also known as FSM, operated out of Vineyard as well. In the 20 Seconds area, the Norton Block gangsters established their Crip set. Every neighborhood had its gang, every gang had its territory, and every territorial dispute was settled with bullets. The violence became self-perpetuating. One murder triggered retaliation, which triggered counter-retaliation, creating cycles that lasted for years. Entire families were marked for death based on which side of an invisible line they lived on. Children grew up knowing they'd either join a gang or become a victim. There was no neutral ground. Then there was Anthony Watkins, known as Fat Tone. He was a rapper from the 51st Street neighborhood who didn't just perform about gang life, he documented it. His 1,998 track Armed Criminal Action featured Tech N, 9Me, and other local artists. He called Kansas City Killa City in his lyrics, and the name stuck because it was accurate. In 2005, Fat Tone was murdered in Las Vegas, apparently in retaliation for another killing he may not have even been involved in. His death triggered chaos back home. Within weeks, his aunt was murdered. Home invasions spiked. Carjackings became daily occurrences. One man was killed at 55th and College just for his hubcaps. Kansas City's violence isn't evenly distributed. It concentrates in specific neighborhoods where decades of neglect created perfect conditions for crime to thrive. Understanding the geography helps explain why the violence persists. East Side tops every dangerous neighborhood list, with over 1,200 violent incidents per 1,000 residents. This isn't just statistics, it's daily reality. Crips and Bloods fight for the same corners they've been fighting over since the 1,990 seconds. Gunfire is so common that residents barely react anymore. Schools function like fortified compounds, with metal detectors and armed security. Nobody walks around after dark unless absolutely necessary. Blue Hills, Ivanhoe Northeast, and Marlboro East form what locals call the Deadly Triangle. Blue Hills registers 1,100 violent incidents per 1,000 residents, specializing in armed robbery. Ivanhoe Northeast hits 1,050 incidents with gang violence that goes back generations. Marlboro East, despite being further south, saw a 15% increase in violent crime in 2025 alone. Marlboro carries the ghost of better times. In 1957, an F5 tornado devastated the Ruskin Heights area. The city rebuilt quickly but cheaply, throwing up low-quality housing that deteriorated rapidly. Bannister Mall opened in 1980 with 180 stores, becoming a regional shopping destination. By 2007, only 50 stores remained. The mall closed and was demolished in 2009, taking jobs and economic stability with it. Hidden Valley sounds peaceful. It's not. Overall, crime runs 377% higher than the national average. Violent crime is 715% above normal. Recently, a couple was found shot dead outside a building after witnesses reported hearing more than a dozen gunshots. The argument that led to their deaths was over something nobody even remembers now. Vineyard and Vineyard Northwest compete for which is more dangerous. Vineyard sees crime rates 361% above average, with violent crime 807% higher than national norms. Vineyard Northwest is worse, 469% higher overall crime, and violent crime exceeding normal rates by 1,042%. An abandoned motel in the Vineyard area serves as a symbol of everything wrong with these neighborhoods. The out-of-state owner in Texas makes promises about development that never materialize. Locals board it up repeatedly, but people rip the boards down to strip copper and solar lights. It sits there, rotting, a magnet for criminal activity that nobody with power seems motivated to fix. Here we are in 2025, and the numbers keep climbing. 150 homicides through November, projecting to around 170 to 180 by year's end. Non-fatal shootings are up 12% compared to 2024. Violent crime remains 412% above the national average. Domestic violence increased 30%. Armed robberies on school buses and in public parks continue regularly. Terrell Bell was 15 when he died in Sycamore Park. Court records show it started with an issue on the school bus. Surveillance footage captured Bell talking with a suspect about fighting. Later, video shows Bell and 3 suspects fighting in the park. Then someone grabbed a gun from a car and Bell was shot. His mother met with Mayor Quinton Lucas afterward. She told reporters she wanted everyone who chased her son down to be charged. One arrest wasn't enough for her. It's never enough. Federal prosecutors indicted 9 gang leaders in 2023 on RICO charges and multiple murder counts. The Parkside Greasies were linked to 5 murders in 2016. These weren't random killings. They were calculated acts by enforcers who used violence as standard operating procedure. Territory gets disputed, block by block, corner by corner, with bodies marking the boundaries. The economics of violence are simple and brutal. Those 70,000 abandoned buildings serve as refuges for criminal activity. The 90,000 vacant lots provide spaces where crimes can happen without witnesses. Businesses close because they can't afford the constant losses from theft and robbery. Grocery stores abandon dangerous neighborhoods, creating food deserts. In areas like Hickman Mills, unemployment hits 25%. In affected zones, poverty rates range from 20 to 30%. It's an impossible cycle. No jobs mean no legitimate income. No income means crime becomes attractive. Crime drives away businesses. No businesses mean no jobs. Round and round it goes. Children inherit this war, whether they want to or not. They grow up with gunfire as background noise. Schools drill active shooter protocols so frequently that kids become numb to them. Tech N9 Nee, the rapper who made it out, remembers living on 58th and Forest with 13 people crammed into his grandmother's house. That was normal for Blue Hills families. Today's children face the same conditions with fewer resources and more violence. Kansas City isn't called Killa City because rappers thought it sounded cool. It's called that because it's earned the name through decades of violence that nobody with real power has seriously tried to stop. This isn't a crime problem. It's a systemic failure that started with deliberate policy decisions almost a century ago. Segregation wasn't accidental. It was enforced through redlining policies that denied mortgages to black families. Neighborhoods were isolated by design. Economic disinvestment wasn't bad luck. It was the predictable result of white flight and factory closures. The criminal infrastructure wasn't imposed from outside. It grew naturally from the corruption planted by the Savella organization and watered by decades of official indifference. Every politician promises solutions. The KCPD uses crime mapping software to identify hotspots, which means they know exactly where the violence happens, but can't or won't prevent it. The Fixing the Killa City program launched in 2019 with noble goals about education and jobs. The funding is insufficient and the results are invisible. Conferences about domestic violence produce recommendations that gather dust. Mayor Lucas criticizes when national media ranks Kansas City among America's most dangerous cities, but his administration hasn't presented any plan that addresses root causes. Federal money flows in and disappears with no measurable impact on violence rates. Real change would require massive investment in quality housing, not token repairs. It would mean demolishing those 70,000 abandoned buildings and building actual communities. It would require jobs that pay living wages, not symbolic job training programs. It would demand rooting out the institutional police corruption that's existed since the Savella days. It would need excellent education from preschool through free university. It would require accessible mental health services and addiction treatment. Most importantly, it would require admitting that everything done so far has failed because it was never serious to begin with. Band-Aids don't heal bullet wounds. Kansas City could change. Other cities have reversed similar levels of violence through sustained commitment and resources. But that requires political will, substantial funding, and decades of consistent effort. It requires treating the disease, not the symptoms. The real question isn't whether change is possible. It's whether anyone with power actually wants it. Because as long as the violence stays concentrated in poor black neighborhoods on the east and south sides, as long as it doesn't spill into wealthy areas, as long as the people dying are the same people who've been dying for 50 years, the incentive to take radical action remains low. Killa City isn't inevitable. It's a choice that gets made every day through inaction, through insufficient funding, through political priorities that value everything except the lives being lost. Every abandoned building is a choice. Every underfunded school is a choice. Every young person without opportunity is a choice someone made. The nickname will stick until those choices change. The killing will continue every 29 hours until the city decides that's unacceptable. Until then, Kansas City has exactly the level of violence it's willing to tolerate.